समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
So, welcome to the first episode of the Worldview with Swasti for 2026. And the flavor of the season is Trump's Donroe Doctrine, under which he has kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, the illegitimate president of Venezuela. But before I introduce you to the expert today, I have to make an appeal. Such quality content takes resources and efforts, and you could help by subscribing to ThePrint and by taking the Print membership so that we are able to continue bringing quality content at the convenience of your click. And now let's get back to Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. And to unpack that, today I have Dr. Vasabjit Banerjee. He's a professor at the University of Tennessee, and he's a well-known face at the Worldview with Swasti, at least. And Vasabjit, it's great to have you back, because just a couple of months ago, when we were discussing what to expect from all the ramping up, the pressure that the US was ramping up around the Caribbean and on Nicolas Maduro, you were, I think, quite clear in saying that his time is going to be up. It's just a matter of time. It could be whatever months or weeks away. But did you expect this cinematic unfolding?
I don't think it's cinematic at all. I mean, this is what was done with bin Laden. I think this was the most stable way to get him out without ruining whatever remains of the country's infrastructure and the institution that really is holding the country together, which is the military of Venezuela, which may not be sufficient to defend against the United States, but is still key to maintaining law and order in Venezuela, as well as running certain key institutions to which it has been given power over by the Chavez Maduro regime. So this was, in a way, and the precedent, as I said, was set by the Noriega action in 1989 in Panama, in which Noriega was taken by the United States on charges of narcotic smuggling as well. Okay. So definitely there is precedent here about how to handle this situation. So it wasn't extraordinary in any fashion.
Right. So the Operation Absolute Resolve was not something that the Latin American theater had not seen earlier, is what, the sense that I get from your statements. Anyway, let's understand what is happening right now. So Nicolas Maduro has been taken to the United States. He has already faced the court once. The next court hearing is on the 17th of March. What fate awaits him? Before I come back to the country and discuss more, what happens to Maduro?
I frankly think that he will be tried according to American laws because of his involvement in narcotic smuggling, which is beyond doubt. I mean, there is a consensus internationally that the Venezuelan regime was involved in it, and they were involved in cartels. Now, there are quibbles about how much, and there's certainly some uncertainty about, when these dictators get involved, it's not like suitcases of cash land up at their house. These things are now quite complicated with bank accounts, offshore bank accounts in the Caribbean, in places like Switzerland. So it will depend on the kind of evidence that is presented against him of processing, being in contact with, accepting money, so on and so forth.
Right. And you mentioned that there's little doubt about the fact that he has been involved in all kinds of, smuggling, as you just mentioned. Now, I have to ask you this thing because, of course, he is an illegitimate president, because there was an election in 2024, July of 2024, that he had lost. But then he managed to come back. Could you just explain what really happened in July of 2024?
Well, in July 2024, the opposition candidate, the original opposition candidate, Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, was effectively debarred from running. And so her surrogate, Edmundo Gonzalez, won the elections quite handily. In 2024, it was a majority of the votes. It was not a plurality. So he had a clear majority of the votes. We don't really know how many, because we suspect it's definitely more than 60 some say more than 70%, because ultimately the results were quashed and rigged results were released by this regime. But the popularity of the regime has been going down for quite some time. It was not unexpected. The regime was relying more increasingly on violence and intimidation.
Right. No, well, I mean, I remember because from the previous discussion that we had exactly on this subject, I think you went into the details, and I'm going to be putting a link of the previous episode in the description box for all the viewers that would like to go and, listen to your analysis on what really went wrong and how did the corruption creep in and etc. But coming quickly now to what is happening in Venezuela. So we see that while Maduro has been taken away along with his wife, now Delcy Rodriguez, who has been the vice president to Maduro, has been made the interim president of Venezuela. Delcy Rodriguez is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but then she is a Maduro protege. She's been with the Maduro regime. In that sense, even though Maduro has gone, but the regime hasn't. So what is it? Is it a regime change? What exactly is Operation Absolute Resolve?
You
I
ask
think
these.
too many descriptions for something that I think don't really understand very well.
You've asked an extremely incisive question here. Effectively, I mean, it's complicated. The answer is complicated, but this is a very simple question that you've placed, but it's quite difficult to answer it. Essentially, there were negotiations going on between the Trump administration and the Maduro administration, of which the point person was Delcy Rodriguez, who, you are correct, was vice president under Maduro, and her brother is also a key player in the regime.
Right.
And it appears that whilst she was negotiating on behalf of Maduro, she also negotiated on behalf of herself.
Okay.
At the same time, the confidence of the Trump administration on Corina Machado, on the Venezuelan opposition in exile, was decreasing. There were numerous attempts at asking them for a clear plan of action on what to do if the regime were to be changed, if they were brought into Venezuela. And it appears that they were unwilling or unable to provide a convincing plan that they would be ready on day one to take over power. If not on day one, then day 30, day 60, without massive American sort of intervention, the kind that President Trump does not want to do. So there's that. So the idea was of the Trump administration was to take President Maduro out and to have Vice President Delcy Rodriguez sort of take charge. It's pretty apparent that was what was planned in some ways. Now, initially, she was unwilling to become president, because once you become president of Venezuela in this fashion, when the president is incapable of carrying out his or her duties, that means a new election has to be called within 30 days.
So do you mean to say that she's going to continue as interim president only for the next 30 days?
No, she was unwilling to even become interim president, because the moment she becomes interim president, there would have to be elections within 30 days. So she remained as vice president, but then she garnered support from key players within the security establishment, such as Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Interior, the Home Minister essentially in Indian terminology, and the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, as well. So the Presidential Guard really did a horrible job defending President Maduro. So she now has a new head of the Presidential Guard, General Lopez, who is, I forget, I may be wrong on his name, but he is also a senior army figure. So essentially what I'm meaning to say is that the army lent her support as a vice president, upon which she then assumed the acting presidency or interim presidency. President Trump has also declared that he is willing to allow her to remain in power longer than 30 days, as mandated by the Venezuelan constitution, for a peaceful transition to take place.
Okay, all right. And so, of course, a lot is unfolding and, a lot is evolving fast. So I'm sure we are going to come back and again assess as to what really happens to Venezuela and its transition to, let's say, a more democratic, government. But before that, help me also understand, Vasabjit, about the Chavista ideology, I mean, because there is, let's say, a curiosity, I mean, at least among the Indian scholars, the strategic community, on how strong is the grip, or let's say, what is the shelf life of the Chavista ideology today in Latin America? After seeing what happened to Venezuela, and Venezuela, whatever happened didn't come overnight, right? I mean, these regimes have been hollowed out by decades of corruption and decades of crime and all that. So, what is the shelf life of the Chavista ideology?
Chavez is a left-wing populist. So let me start right at the end and say that they have around 30-35% support in the population, I would argue, even today.
Okay.
So it's not entirely gone.
Okay.
But it's not a majority. It's lost the majority for a long time. Right. It depended essentially on the popular support, this is populism, part of the name, and the idea was to redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth, or the revenues from Venezuela's oil wealth, to the poorest in Venezuela. Venezuela was a highly unequal society. The older system in Venezuela, it was democracy, but between two political parties, COPEI and Acción Democrática, and it was quite corrupt, and it was quite oligarchic and elite dominated. These are all well-recognized things. And it was a way to redistribute wealth to the poorest in Venezuela, and it used resources garnered from the energy boom, if you remember this, from the early 2000s until the mid-2010s. In fact, I think it was 2012, 2013.
Yes, that's right.
And there was massive wealth redistributed. Now, the reliance on oil wealth to sort of garner public support meant that it drove out all other productive sectors of the Venezuelan economy, made Venezuela even more dependent on oil. And inevitably, as these things happen, the oil economy crashed. And as the prices crashed and they were unable to continue sort of providing for the people, and there was popular unrest, the regime turned to more violent and intimidation and violence to retain power. So, and in the meanwhile, it had undercut all sorts of institutions in Venezuela. After the failed coup of 2002, the military was sort of brought in under control with Cuban intelligence services, with special sort of, incentives such as corruption, access to narcotic deals, control over government state-owned firms, public sector firms, as you call them in India, and as well as monitoring and enforcement by the Cubans, as I said. So the military was brought in, the judiciary was undercut, the National Assembly was sort of pushed aside, and in its place a new sort of pliant National Assembly was installed. So all of these started happening because the real legitimacy that the regime had derived from high oil sales, oil revenues, was no longer there.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Cuba there, because that was going to be my next question. And, one of the striking features about Operation Absolute Resolve and the manner in which Maduro was ousted, kidnapped, whichever way you'd like to describe it, that 32 Cuban officers died. And then when we sort of want to understand that further, we come to the fact that Maduro had, at least his intelligence apparatus, the presidential intelligence apparatus, the security apparatus, was basically all Cuban. Why so?
Well, isn't that a great question? Because the regime doesn't have legitimacy. So it doesn't trust even those on the most interior parts of the regime, in the presidential guard and in the intelligence services, especially the Director General of the military intelligence. I've heard even SEBIN, which is their sort of civilian intelligence, their version of foreign intelligence. Also, there are Cubans there as well. Cuba denied this. Cuba said that we do not have anybody. And now they're saying, well, we've lost 32 people. So it's pretty...
Course, flag for half-mast, and of course,
so it's pretty apparent what happened. Cuba had infiltrated the entire Venezuelan intelligence apparatus and was monitoring and controlling Venezuelan folks who were working under them. So this means that there is distrust even at the heart of this regime, and this is quite damning. But it also shows Cuba's penetration of Venezuela. Now, what does Cuba have to offer? That's the question. Cuba is not a wealthy country. What it has done since the 1970s in Angola and other African countries. But since the 1960s, even against the wishes of Moscow, people do not know this, but Moscow did not want Cuba to support insurgents and rebellions all across Latin America. But Cuba has done this. Cuba has sent operatives in friendly regimes to help them sort of beef up their intelligence apparatus and, in some cases, the military as well.
Um, and if I'm not wrong, it's this relationship is also pretty transactional in the sense that while Cuba is sending the doctors and Cuba is sending, I mean, Hugo Chavez was also got treated for his cancer in Havana, if I'm not wrong, and intelligence and security apparatus, etc. Venezuela is sending about 30,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba. Now, United States has put a foot down and said that no more of this. Russia also, supplies a lot of oil to Cuba. Now, I mean, just as we are recording this, there's news that the American Coast Guard have captured and have, descended on Marinera, which was a Russian vessel, which was carrying something that we do not yet know precisely. So, I mean, how does this evolve? I mean, what is happening? Do you think this basically is an indication that a similar kind of an action is imminent against Cuba as well? Or is my reading a bit of a, jumping the gun?
The Cuban regime is wholly illegitimate. I mean, it
Okay.
sounds nice.
Understand that, Vasabjit, because there is a continuing perception. When the operation happened against Venezuela, one of the huge outcries in India was, how can the United States kidnap a legitimate or a serving president of a sovereign country? And of course, as you know, that this sounds very black and white, and the situation in Latin America isn't that black and white. But Venezuela, we are trying to understand well now, thanks to experts like you. But help us understand, why is Cuba so illegitimate?
Well, the Cuban regime is an authoritarian regime. It's never hidden that. It's a communist regime, officially. But really, communism is part of the ruling ideology beyond rhetoric, beyond just speeches, ceased to exist after the Cold War. It was not possible for the Cuban regime to exist as a communist regime.
Okay.
The Cuban regime has, it's not involved in narcotics per se. I mean, there are characters involved, is what I hear. But the Cuban regime is highly authoritarian. It is anti-American, and the existence of the Cuban regime was guaranteed by the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis, by an agreement that America would not invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles. This was part of essentially the deal. The deal has ceased to exist since 1991, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And Cuba, as a major source of instability, its intelligence apparatus is deeply involved in Venezuela. It continues to create problems in the region. It supports regimes such as those in Nicaragua. So it is a malign actor in the region. Not only that, it has not had. It is not a democracy. I mean, it's in your face. It's not a democracy, and it's an authoritarian regime with a highly repressive government. And I'd like to make a comment about this. This is not Castro's Cuba. Castro has passed away. Raul Castro has passed away. This is not the revolutionary Cuba that people think of in the 1960s and 70s and even 80s that stood
People
for...
romanticize, actually. Yeah, the correct word there is romanticize. Yeah.
Romanticize, or even stood for something. This has essentially become a mafia state of people associated, second, third generation folks associated with the Communist Party in name only, that manages to repress its people and operate this regime. So to call Cuba a legitimate regime based on the memory of Fidel Castro is quite incorrect.
Okay. So what is your reading of Donald Trump's Donroe Doctrine unfolding in Cuba?
I don't think there's any specific Donroe Doctrine that's distinct from the past. You see, Cuba has become a fortress for Chinese and Russian interests. And the United States has realized, especially in this administration, that whilst the United States was trying to create peace and order and stability in the Middle East, which is under the Carter Doctrine, by the way, its own areas near abroad was getting undermined by China and Russia. China became the top trading partner. I do not know the statistics of 2025. Was the top trading partner of 3 of the 5 top economies in Latin America. Russia had major defense and economic ties with countries such as Venezuela, Argentina, and Brazil. So the Trump administration realized that it had to turn towards Latin America to reassert United States' traditional predominance in the region.
But Vasabjit, let me just pull you back and ask you once again: do you think Cuba is the next target?
I think that it depends on what you mean by target. Does this decrease the economic lifelines upon which the Cuban regime is relying upon, and thereby pressuring it to an extent where it will fall? I would argue yes, because the Cuban regime was on the back foot in the 1990s. It received a lease of life based on cheap Venezuelan energy exports in the 2000s, increasing Chinese investment and coordination with Cuba in the 2000s. And if those are switched off, the regime is again put on the back foot. Whether there will be a similar change in Cuba, we will see. But if you notice, President Trump has not done an Iraq or even Afghanistan in Venezuela. The change that is being posited today, that is being proposed today, is quite a gradual change. Maduro has been taken out, and his deputy has been put in there to administer a transition, which, because she's in charge, I assume will give immunity from prosecution to senior members of the regime and guarantee them some access to their wealth, for the lack of a better word, if not political power, and acknowledge the role of their party in Venezuelan politics in the future.
Okay.
And if that is the sort of intervention that Cuba is looking at, then it's quite a mild way to transform the Cuban system. And I think the Cuban regime should be grateful that that's the way it's being dealt with.
Okay. All right. Interesting. And since we're discussing so much about the extra-regional powers here and their role, which is very obvious, and let me just ask you this question, there's been a lot of brainstorming around what would be the response from China or Russia, because they have legitimate interests in Venezuela. And I know that from our previous discussion, we've been discussing that they are only going to do at best maybe lip service. Russia did send a plane full of weapons. I don't know what they were, maybe air defenses, but nothing seemed to work. Why do you think that it has been reduced to this kind of lip service? I mean, we expected lip service, but perhaps something more with it. Why this radio silence when it comes to taking any kind of action?
Well, firstly, I would argue that the radio is the one thing that hasn't been silent. There's a lot of talk.
Maybe it's of a performative. I think that is what I was doing.
There's a lot of performativeness about this, because Russia did in prior years, I think it was 2019, Russia did send bombers over to Caracas to show that that Russia was willing to participate. But Russia is unable, even if it's willing, to do such an intervention today. It just doesn't have the capacity. We can also see the Russian air defense systems are incapable of fighting a first-class sort of attack by the United States or a power like Israel. So we know that they're not technologically superior. By the way, Venezuela has the A300. It doesn't have the A400. So it's an older system that may have already been worked out by the United States. So Russia's existing weapon system don't work. Russia doesn't have the ability to supply new weapon systems. Russia does want the sanctions on Venezuela to persist because the sanctions maintain higher international oil prices. Now let's talk about China. China wants cheap oil. And China is not just invested in...
After the sanctions of 2019, the bulk of Venezuelan oil was going to China, right?
So, yes. So, I mean, China wants cheap oil. Not merely that. Russia and Iran have been taken off the international market. So Venezuela, if it comes to a settlement and all the sanctions are removed, then China benefits by getting cheap oil. China is also invested in Guyana. in the Guyanese oil. And Venezuela threatened Guyana with war all throughout 2024. People tend to forget that, with essentially annexation of 2/3 of Guyana, the Essequibo region. And so that would have really destabilized oil prices. So this regime, at the end of its days, appeared to be doing things such as, annexing its neighbors, which certainly China doesn't want right now, because that would really set the international oil market on fire. So China, yes, it's in China's interest to lend support to the Venezuelan regime in rhetoric, but actuality, China benefits from increased supply of oil in the international market, as well as no threats against its investments in Guyana.
Right. But here I have to ask you a question, because that's a very interesting observation that you made about China, that, rhetorically, it sort of suits the Chinese narrative to, to critique what happened and to sort of condemn the US action, but it stands to gain. But, Donald Trump has gone on record telling Delcy Rodriguez to cut off ties from China, from Iran, from Russia, and has asked her that now US companies are going to be investing and we are going to be buying. In fact, recently, just before, as I was prepping for this discussion with you, the United States and Venezuela have reached an agreement to export up to $2 billion worth of crude to the United States. And as the infrastructure improves, hopefully, because right now it's in tatters, you will see more of that oil coming to, towards the United States. How does then this benefit China? Because one of the things that United States administration under Donald Trump has been saying again and again is to keep away from the Western Hemisphere.
Well, I don't think that President Trump believes that China can be entirely removed from the Western Hemisphere. What it wants China to have is a position in Western Hemisphere as a trading power, like France or Britain or Germany. It does not want its power to be sufficient to exert political power or military power in the region. I think there's an understanding that China has investments there, and they're legitimate investments. But there are also investments in places like Panama Canal, in places like ports in Peru, places like the energy sector in Venezuela, where it hurts or threatens core U.S. Political interests and military interests. So those China will not be allowed to have. And I think if you read the between the lines, that's sort of the differentiation that the Trump administration is making.
Right. And since we're discussing oil, we have to come to India, because one of the things that, in my understanding, India also stands to gain if the sanctions are removed, because about in 2013, around that time, we were getting about 10% of our oil from Venezuela. And the bilateral trade was running in double digits, billions of dollars. But then, it is easier said than done, because we all understand that right now, the situation, the infrastructure, the technology, everything is in tatters. And you have to first inject a lot of money into the Venezuelan infrastructure, especially around oil, in order to bring it to a level that it starts to, become an exporter again. What are your thoughts on that from an Indian perspective?
I think it's a grand opportunity for India. I think Indian petrochemical companies should invest in infrastructure in Venezuela, try to buy into Venezuela. If sanctions are removed, India can, of course, import oil from Venezuela, as it was, and India's sought exemptions from sanctions for many years for importing oil from Venezuela. So that's there. But I think it's also an opportunity for Indian petrochemical companies to invest in Venezuela and revamp Venezuela's infrastructure in coordination, in collaboration with American companies. Perhaps India can give skilled labor to Venezuela, whereas American labor would be more expensive in the petrochemical sector, so on and so forth. So I think it's a grand opportunity for India. Also, India has close ties with Guyana. So a regime that does not threaten Guyana and the petroleum from Guyana would be in India's interest.
Right. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, of course, in my own analysis, I've argued that it is a good opportunity for India, and India should be looking at that. Because, why this comes, because in India, there was also this backlash against not criticizing and condemning the US action. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's this idea that international law is sort of paramount in this case against the protection of heads of state. And I do agree in the main with it. But as India faced a similar situation in 1971, international law forbade it from invading another country taking it over and breaking it apart. But
And you're
because
also in Bangladesh, right? I mean, for the
yes, about
benefit
Bangladesh, and
many of our young viewers who probably do not know what we're referring to, we're referring to the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War here. Yes, go ahead.
and so, but India had a massive refugee crisis on its hands. 10 million Bangladeshis were sitting in India, destabilizing West Bengal, and I'd say it changed West Bengal politics forever after that. So India was facing this, and today Venezuelan refugees, 8 million of them from a population of 28 million, are destabilizing politics from Chile to Peru. Now that Chile has had a right-wing president elected. To Peru, a lot of them have fled now to Peru, to Colombia. We obviously know that. To parts of Brazil and the border areas of Guyana, not to mention politics in the United States as well, in the state of Florida. So this is a massive refugee crisis. Not merely that, there's the narcotics crisis. And so law has to apply, but the law cannot be taken advantage of by malign actors who use it to defend themselves, to cloak themselves in legality while carrying out illegal actions.
Well, I'm glad you put it that way, Dr. Banerjee. Of course, that's why we require, an expert's insights into understanding what is going on in faraway regions. And thank you for putting it all together. And just as my last question, and briefly, if you can, what should we be watching out for in the next few weeks and months?
Well, I think we need to see whether there's a smooth regime transition, because international oil prices depend on it. It's important for India to note that. The assumption is that the core institution upon which this regime depends on, which is the Venezuelan army, will remain cohesive, will remain able to exert itself on Venezuelan society to maintain law and order, as well as remain united. So let's see whether those things happen. If not, we may have to have either a greater US involvement in Venezuela in terms of troops on the ground, if this regime starts crumbling, either because of elite defections or bottom up from mutinies and junior officers' coups, or some form of a regional force, maybe of Brazil and Colombia, who have effectively done a great job at their border areas, especially Brazil, to curtail sort of a greater regional fallout from Venezuela's travails, recent travails.
Right. So the key takeaway then is the situation is evolving and much is going to depend on these critical factors that you just mentioned. And on that note, I have to thank you, Professor Vasabjit Banerjee, for once again helping us understand, all these complex layers in Latin American politics and, of course, Venezuela and the new Donald Trump administration that we are all watching with bated breath. And you are watching Worldview with Swasti, so stay tuned for yet another episode.